Hi guys, happy Sunday. Well, as I mentioned in class, I'm not doing too well on pacing things. Chances are we won't have a chance to get through chapter 25 before the final. So I'm just releasing this video for you just so you can review this material in a format other than just reading the textbook. Chapter 25, though, is pretty brief. Chances are you've already downloaded and looked at the study guide. And as you know, there's just a few artists on it. So what I want to do here is just walk you through them real quick and just kind of introduce you to some contemporary artists who are active and working today. So let's go ahead and pull up my presentation here. Yeah. Oops, let me hide this. All right. So as you can see here in the outline, there are no isms for this chapter. No futurism, conceptualism, feminism, whateverism, postmodernism. Everything is just grouped together according to medium. But all of these artists are alive and working today. This is all about contemporary art. And before I get started, I just do want to acknowledge a little elephant in the room, something that kind of annoys me whenever people discuss contemporary art. There's this sort of feeling that it's not as good as it used to be. These sort of memes I see floating around all the time. The idea, I suppose, being that today's artists lack any skill because art is no longer an emphasis on creating things realistically. And of course, these memes are not very helpful. They're rather simplistic. And it also seems to come from the perception that good art is art that's a number one on the abstractometer. And as we've already seen, that is not the only purpose of art. And yeah, whenever I see these sort of memes, I just think, like, what if this was applied to music? What if people dismissed contemporary music because it wasn't as good as what we normally thought of? For example, music then. Versus music now. Okay, that's about as much as I can take. You get what I mean. If we just completely dismiss all of modern art and lump it together into that sort of strange conceptual category, like, what if we did the same to music? What if this was our only basis for contemporary music? Anyway, you get the point that I'm making. Let's move on to something a bit more serious. All right, so this is just a little flowchart that I put together of what I think of whenever I think of contemporary art. The last chapter, chapter 24, is all about artists sort of seeing what they could change, almost stripping things out from the art world. But today, that's no longer the case. Artists today really are really skilled. There's some really original, incredible works of art. I hope that you'll like some of the pieces that the book goes over. But yeah, as you can see here, whenever I think of contemporary art, I think of people who have gone to art school, people who have thorough academic training, and with that, a real knowledge of art history and an understanding of the medium. Contemporary artists are very self-aware. They're not quite so self-important as artists of the previous century. I don't know, someone like Joseph Beuys. Artists today have a real sense of humor. They really do captivate you with their sense of humor, but there's also a heavy conceptual element in a lot of works of contemporary art, something where you kind of have to understand what the artist was trying to say, art that carries a message and isn't just visually appealing. But a lot of contemporary art is just that. But it's no longer just simply oil on canvas over and over again. Contemporary artists use new media, different techniques. So I'm always harping on you guys, of course, to read the label. And that's especially important whenever you deal with contemporary art, something that may seem kind of unappealing whenever you read the label and realize that this piece was made with, say, rattlesnake venom, as a piece at the Scab Museum recently was. It catches your attention. It's a very unusual media and an unusual technique. But down there at the bottom is the big word for contemporary art. The word is appropriation. And this is something that comes up a lot in pop culture, whether you're discussing music or food or visual art. It's basically dealing with inspiration, what sort of ideas you're borrowing or referencing. So appropriation comes up quite a lot with all of the artists that will be discussed here. And I wanted to start my contemporary art lecture by introducing you to an artist that is working today, whose work I think is extraordinary. If I think back to that art then versus art now, and people think of art now as being completely abstract, unskilled, and uninteresting, that does not apply to someone like Kehinde Wiley. His art is extraordinary. He's a brilliant painter. This is an oil on canvas. It's enormous and it's so visually beautiful, but it's also conceptually interesting. And it does definitely use that procedure of appropriation. What Kehinde Wiley does is he introduces himself to people. Sometimes they're friends, sometimes they're just strangers on the streets. And he'll offer to paint them. And what they do is leaf through a bunch of art history books and pick a pose. And Kehinde Wiley will paint them in that pose, but with their sort of simple street clothes. And I don't know, I just think this is such a cool juxtaposition, the sort of poncy 17th century French king versus this sort of urban, affluent hip-hop culture, the sort of interest in one's appearance that's sort of very casual, but also very aware and concerned with one's appearance that you see in both of these categories. This is what I think of whenever I think of contemporary art, referencing old ideas, but putting a cool, interesting spin on them. Contemporary art is like a heavy metal cover of a classical song. It's different, but it works. Anyway, I'm babbling. So let's go over some of the works that are in the textbook and will be on the test. This is an artist who is from the United States, active and works in the United States. He's from Los Angeles. And usually whenever I show this in class, I ask what sort of visuals, what sort of ideas is Gaijin Fujita referencing here? What is he appropriating? And some of the things people see, street art, graffiti, video game culture, the two people facing off with the word fight in big letters. But there's also a big reference to Japanese prints. These two samurai warriors are pulled directly from these sort of 17th century ukiyo-e Japanese prints. And take a look at the medium here. Gold leaf, spray paint, paint marker on wood panel on this large 4-foot wide triptych. It's a really interesting medium, and it's, I think, a very visually appealing work of art. I've never seen hip-hop culture meet Japanese Shogun era Japanese art. I've never seen graffiti mixed with gold leaf. It's such an unusual combination, but it is very visually appealing. There's a sort of a sense of humor, a self-awareness to his art, and just the sort of blending together of printmaking and graffiti, tattooing, Japanese culture, American culture, something that's very personal. And that's another thing I should mention about contemporary artists. They're not as cliquey as artists were in, say, the early 20th century, where everyone was banding together and forming groups like the Fauvists or the Dadaists or the Surrealists. Today's artists are a bit more independent. Yeah, something else that I usually go over in class is showing videos of these artists, speeches that they've given, lectures, walks through their galleries and studios. I won't be doing that here, just in the interest of time, and also because, as you may have noticed, playing videos doesn't work too well whenever I'm using this screen cap footage. Anyhow, yeah, so you kind of get the idea of Gaijin Fujita's art. I think this art is excellent. It's extraordinary. And even if you look at it and you say, oh, I still liked old art better. I like Renaissance era portraits. I like Romanticism, Neoclassicism. That's fine. But I guess my point is that there's enough room in the world for different types of art, new types of art. And that sort of, oh, I could do that, sort of dismissal that people think that they have whenever they see contemporary art, well, that doesn't apply to someone like this artist here. It might apply to this artist, though. So some of you guys may already be somewhat familiar with Cindy Sherman. One of the homework options is to read up a bit on Cindy Sherman and take a look at some of her works of art and try and recreate it in a photograph. All right, so this work, as you can see from the title, is called Untitled Film Still, number 48. And what she's appropriating here is, well, movies, a film still. This is from a series of works. They're all just called simply the film stills. All of them are just simply called Untitled, Untitled number 50, Untitled number 70. Whenever we get to class, I'll pass around a catalog of some of her work. But if you've already taken a look at the homework assignment, how do I get myself out of the way here? There, that's better. You can have a look at some of the other works in the film still series. Yeah, so the objective of the homework assignment is to look at these photographs and recreate them yourself. But something that's fun to keep in mind whenever you look at the work of Cindy Sherman is that this is all the same person. Every girl in the series is actually Cindy Sherman. Her shtick, you might say, her sort of trick is that she creates these works of art that look like film stills, but they're actually just her in costume taking timed self-portraits. But then again, they're not self-portraits because none of these are really pictures of her. I mean, they are. It's just kind of tricky to know how to put Cindy Sherman's art. She's taken just hundreds of pictures of herself. You can look through her catalog and get a sense of what her art is like. Whoops, there it goes. Yeah, so it's all of these pictures, and she's in every one of them, but they're not really her. They feel like pictures of other people. She works in series. This is from her clown series, which some of my students find a little unsettling. These are from her society portrait series. I feel like I could write a paper on these girls. I feel like I could come up with a story about all of these women. And I recognize them in an odd way. It's hard to say exactly what makes Cindy Sherman's art so special. I heard one art historian explain it as she's the first photographer to use the camera to make art. She's not just taking pictures of things. And I think that's a pretty good way to sum it up. I'll pass around, like I said, one of her catalogs in class, but I do like to sort of look up and see what these artists are up to today. Gaijin Fujita, I saw, has recently curated a show. One of the things that the art world is now talking about is the fact that Cindy Sherman is now on Instagram. I don't know. I think these works are hilarious. And they kind of complicate her whole body of work, but also fit in well with her body of work. The idea that she's taking selfies, but they're not really her. They're not self-portraits. They're they're like pictures of other people. So I guess you could take a critical reading of her Instagram account and put it in the read of social media, self-portraiture, arm-length selfies. But I don't know. Take it as you will. Her art is kind of divisive. Some people think that she's a total nut. I think she's brilliant and funny and hilarious. I love Cindy Sherman's art. She's such a wacko. Let's see. Anyhow, coming back here. Oh yeah, this artist here, I didn't put him on the test, but something that I like to do whenever I show this in class is say, all right, how was this image made? The medium is just listed as photography, but if you were to take a close look, you'd see that what it actually is a photograph of a floor with trash scattered all over it. This is dirt that's been swept into a pattern. You can see clothes, you can see some electronics, just a bunch of garbage strewn about on the floor, and he's taken an aerial photograph of it. So something that's unusual media, unusual execution, that's how Vic Muniz creates his art. He's a really captivating photographer, and yet I don't want to just classify him as photography because this is also sort of like, I don't know, like a collage perhaps, maybe even performance art, the things that he creates. And of course, appropriation, making references to famous works of art. Like this is a reference to a famous painting by Caravaggio of Medusa. And you can see it's clearly done in spaghetti sauce. And over here, you may recognize this image. It's Jackson Pollock, but done in chocolate syrup. This is a piece that he created recently. I imagine you can understand what visual reference he's making here. And I think you can also get a sense of exactly what he used to create this work of art. Or this one here, this is a reference to a work of art by an artist named Corot. But how was this image made? Is it a drawing? No, it's string that he has laid across a piece of white paper. It's a really unusual work of art, but talented, definitely. This is another work I saw on his website. This is one of those things where I imagine that if you went to a museum and you saw this thing, your friend sitting next to you would be like, why did they put all these nails in Mickey? But you would be like, oh, I understood that reference. Now you have a bit of a background in art history and art appreciation, and perhaps you can understand some of the references that these artists are making. Kind of lets you in on the joke a bit. As for what Vic Muniz is up to recently, one of his bigger, more impactful works of art was in 2015 whenever he crashed the Venice Biennale with this piece addressing the migrant crisis of Italy. A large boat that's been styled after a headline about migrants drowning off the coast of Lampedusa. So dealing with sort of current events here. All right. One of the works that is explained upon in your textbook, but is pictured back on Chapter 2, is Maya Lin's Vietnam Veterans Memorial. This is probably the best known war memorial in the United States. It's definitely the most visited war memorial in Washington, D.C. But the story behind its conception and creation is kind of unusual. All right, so the piece is designed as just simply two wings of black granite with names written all over it, names listed of people who died or are missing in action in Vietnam. Most of the names have a diamond next to them, but every once in a while you'll see one with this sort of plus sign. Here, let me get out my pen. So the reason why they use the cross isn't because it's a religious significance, it's because they can fill it in. If this prisoner of war, this person missing in action, is confirmed as having died in action, they bring in an engraving machine and they fill it in. And as a matter of fact, that's what happened with this name here. It was recently converted from a cross to a diamond. The third symbol that was designed is a circle around the cross. This represents the sort of circle of life, and this refers to someone who is a prisoner of war, missing in action, but has recovered, has returned alive. There are over 58,000 names on the Vietnam Wall, and search all you want, you won't find a single one of these symbols. Not a single prisoner of war has returned since this work of art was created in 1982. So it's a very impactful, really deep, profound work of art. But something you may not know is that it was designed by someone who is only about 23 years old. Maya Lin was a graduate student in architecture whenever she submitted this design. It was an open call for entries, a blind entry as well. Artists were selected based on the quality of their design, not on their fame. So Maya Lin, out of all of this thousands of submissions, won the contest with her submission. It's an excellent example of minimalism, very simple design, very sleek, and it's designed to connect these two monuments, the Lincoln Memorial, the Washington Memorial, kind of off to the side here in the National Mall. But it wasn't without controversy. Most people really approved of the design, as did many Vietnam veterans groups. But there was some controversy around it. Some people felt that it was a disgrace, that it was an insult to the people who served, because it's black. It's not a white marble memorial like so many others. The fact that it's sunken into the ground as opposed to rising above the ground like other war memorials. The fact that it is conceptual, that it is minimalistic. It's not a sculpture of a soldier. There's no patriotic images on it. It's just this black marble slab. And unfortunately, there was also some rather racist objections to it. The fact that it was designed by someone named Maya Lin, someone who was a child of Chinese immigrants. Some people just had to play that card and say that someone with Asian heritage shouldn't be allowed to design the Vietnam Veterans Memorial. Fortunately, that objection was cast off, but there was enough opposition to this memorial that they kind of had to appease the critics a bit. Some senators would not sign off on this unless they made it a bit more traditional. But Maya Lin stood firm. She would not compromise on her design. So 2 years after this piece was erected, a second memorial was put in place, a second Vietnam Veterans Memorial designed by, I believe, Frederick Hart Benton. I don't have my notes in front of me here. One that's a bit more literal, a bit more figurative, one that looks a bit more like a soldier's memorial. And even then, some people, I guess, weren't pleased because a third Vietnam Veterans Memorial was erected sometime in the 1990s, the Vietnam Women's Memorial. So 3 monuments all within a few paces of each other, and yet whenever people think of the Vietnam Veterans Memorial, this is what they think of. The wall, the V, the wall with the names on it. And in class, there's usually a spirited discussion about, what do you think about these extra 2 memorials? Do you think they were necessary? Do you think that they're explicitly unnecessary? I mean, do they bring anything to the table? Do they detract from Maya Lin's design? It's an interesting conversation, especially in an era whenever memorials and monuments are very much in the public opinion right now. But as for the man who designed the second memorial, he loved Maya Lin's design, and he didn't want to detract from it in any way. So as you can see, he had his sculptural group set aside. I've talked to people who have visited the Vietnam Veterans Memorial, and they didn't even realize that this group was there. They were just so focused on Maya Lin's design. And yeah, I think that's how it should be. My personal opinion is that these additional statues aren't necessary maybe they don't detract from Maya Lin's design, but I think that her design is simple and profound enough that these two additions, while perhaps not detracting from Maya Lin's design, I don't think they really benefit it. But that's just my opinion. As for what is she up to today, Maya Lin went on to a very successful career as an architect. She also designed a number of memorials and outdoor works of art. She recently, though, announced that she's going to step back from designing memorials and focus instead on an overarching project about extinction and diminishing animal species, a project called What is Missing, that you can look up if you're interested. All right. Next artist is the guy that I wrote my thesis on, Fred Wilson. I wrote my graduate thesis on Fred Wilson. Ask me anything. I could talk about him and his art all day. He's a fascinating artist. But his shtick, you might say, is that he's not really a visual artist so much as a conceptual artist and installation artist. What he does, and what he's especially known for, is being invited to museums and going into their collection and creating exhibits based on what he finds in the collection, juxtaposing objects in order to make a statement or make a point. As you could probably tell, I'm very interested in museums and how they display works of art. And Fred Wilson addresses things very interestingly. What you're looking at here is an installation view from his most famous project, Mining the Museum. This was done at the Baltimore, or at the Maryland Historical Society in Baltimore. He came to this museum and he realized that there weren't a whole lot of things in the collection that dealt with Native American history nor African American history. And as someone who had heritage in both of those races, he felt that perhaps this museum didn't speak to him. So mining the museum refers both to digging, to mining objects, to trying to dig something out from the ground, but also making the museum mine, making it speak to me. So what he's done here, obviously we've got some cigar store Indian statues, these stereotypical, borderline racist depictions of Native Americans were the only things he could find that dealt with Native American history in the collection. So what he's done here is turn them around, had them face the wall, and what they're facing are photographs that he found also in the collection of members of the Baltimore community who are, in fact, Native American. So it's like the stereotype is facing the reality, almost as though they're having a conversation with each other. At least this is the installation view chosen in their textbook. The installation that I thought was more profound was what you saw whenever you first came into the museum. In the center here is a globe that says truth. And on the left, we have 3 blank pedestals. And over on the right, 3 full pedestals. And they all have names. This one is Henry Clay, Joseph Bonaparte, and Andrew Jackson. And over here on the left are these empty pedestals, and they have labels on them that say Harriet Tubman, Frederick Douglass, Benjamin Banneker. You probably know at least the first 2 names, 2 African American, very important figures in American history. And all 3 of those, Harriet Tubman, Frederick Douglass, Benjamin Banneker, they are all from Baltimore. And yet the Maryland they're all from Maryland, and yet the Maryland Historical Society didn't have any portrait busts of them. But they did have a portrait bust of Napoleon. So it's almost like he's saying, why would there be images of people like Andrew Jackson and Napoleon, people who had nothing to do with Maryland's history, and yet over here, we have no objects that deal with these 3 immensely important figures in Maryland history. You see what he's trying to say here? Using what's not there to make a point about the museum and also about American history. I don't know, I just think his art is really brilliant, really subtle. Or what about this? How many people are in this painting? At first glance, you might say 5, but there is actually 7. There are 2 small black children on the corners of the composition. What he did was he found all of these pictures of these children of wealthy landowners of Maryland, and in the background there are these African American children, probably slaves. This little boy here has a collar on him. And some people who worked at the museum would comment, "Oh, I had never even noticed that boy in the background." But Fred Wilson, his eye went right to it. So what he did was, whenever you walked up to these paintings, a spotlight, a literal spotlight, would be shone on these figures, sort of making you notice the uncomfortable history in the background and not just focus on the lovely oil paintings of these rich landowners' children. Yeah, here's a picture of the installation view with the spotlights shining on them. This one was pretty controversial. It's called Modes of Transport. It's a bunch of baby carriages, things that he found in the basement. And inside one of them, he puts another thing that he found in the basement in storage at the Maryland Historical Society. Yeah, whenever I flash this screen up in the classroom, there's usually a series of ooh reactions. I think it's pretty clear what he's trying to say, putting a Klan hood inside of this baby carriage. And again, it's almost up to you to sort of put the pieces together to figure out what is he saying. This place that tells the history of Maryland, this is the Maryland Historical Society. Well, is this part of American history as well? Should this sort of subject be breached by American museums? And it just makes me think these days there's a lot of talk about Confederate memorials and what are they really commemorating? Is it just, part of our history and something that we should leave up, or is it something terrible and controversial and shameful, something that should be hidden away? What is our responsibility in educating our children on this aspect of American history? The Klan, racism, slavery. He brings together a lot of interesting ideas just simply by putting this with this. It's a really, really interesting juxtaposition here. And this here is called metalwork. This is something that the museum would be very proud to show, their collection of beautiful silver work. As a matter of fact, the Telfair Museum has a collection of silver work too that they had on display. But he put something else there. Slave shackles, like handcuffs with a key there at the bottom. So it just makes you think. You admire the beauty of these objects, and then by simply putting these shackles here, he reminds you of the hands that carried this silver. He's not really making a comment so much, or a statement, as making you think. It's a very heavy, very conceptual piece that, I don't know, I just think it's really smart, really targeted. My personal favorite exhibit of his, and the one that I focus on my thesis, was whenever he went to the Seattle Art Museum and addressed their collection of art, and especially how museums display African art versus American art, and just how the display methods affect the way that you perceive a work of art. But I'm kind of getting into the rabbit trails here. Don't want to get too off topic. But I do want to say, I thought this was really clever. What he added here to this display of African objects, African clothing and textiles, you may recognize that kente cloth there in the corner, a business suit. And he added this little placard down here that tells us this object is a business suit, and it is worn by some African members of the tribe in order to connote education and, I don't know, just a very clever way to make you think about how museums shape our perception of foreign cultures. But obviously, I'm a big fan of his art. He really changes the way that you see museums and collections. So naturally, whenever he came to Savannah a few years ago, I was very excited to meet him and also give him a copy of my thesis. I never did hear back from him, though. So, yeah, if you ever bump into Mr. Fred Wilson, ask him if he read my paper and ask him what he thinks. I doubt he read it, though. He's a busy man. Anywho's. All right. This is one of my favorite contemporary artists. This is Banksy. Some of you guys may have heard of him. What is his medium? Street art. He's a graffiti artist. He's a British artist. No one knows his name. Well, at least he has not publicly made his identity known. He simply goes by Banksy. And he's one of those cases where whenever I'm researching contemporary artists, oops, no, I don't want to keep my pictures. He's someone who's always up to something. He always has a new work of art to look at. He's always in the news. He's always making, always creating. Some of these artists haven't had a show in years, but this guy is always doing something. So I would recommend you head over to his official website, banksy.co.uk, to see what he's up to these days. One of his biggest projects now is creating this actual hotel that you can actually book a visit to see in Pakistan, addressing the barrier between Pakistan and Israel. This is something that has been a source of quite a lot of controversy, and also was something that got him in the public eye to begin with whenever he actually tagged that wall separating the border between Israel and Pakistan. He actually took some spray paints and tagged that wall facing gunfire from Israeli police. It was quite an extraordinary story. But as for some of Banksy's pieces, I'll pass around a book of his during class. He has those references to art history, that very smart, funny sort of sense of humor about his art that someone with an education in art history, like you now have, can appreciate. His art also brings up an interesting other concept, the part of money. How much does money play in contemporary art? Because he's someone who is anonymous, who doesn't have a following on Instagram. He's not on Twitter. He's not on Facebook. If you want to buy one of his works of art, it's virtually impossible unless you were to go to a show like this. Pieces by Banksy have been chiseled off of walls and are now hanging in museums and in private collections. His work is very prone to getting vandalized. This man here is trying to steal a wall, a chunk of wall that he did in New Orleans. And yeah, in class, typically we have a conversation about this. What do you think about Banksy's art being stolen off walls and put in museums? Do you think it's kind of blasphemous, or do you think it should stay where it is? And if it does stay where it is, well, sometimes this happens. His pieces get painted over by people who just see graffiti. They don't see a work of art by one of the greatest contemporary artists working today. Or the piece can get torn down. The entire building could be demolished along with this work of art. Is that what makes a work of art good? How much it sells for? Yeah, it's also something that Banksy himself has acknowledged. Again, being a very self-aware, very humorous artist. But in the interest of time and brain cells and staying on topic, I'll just leave it at that. I would recommend you head over to banksy.co.uk if you're interested. But thank you for sticking around for this little extra presentation. I'm sorry that we couldn't go over this in class, but I do appreciate you tuning in. And here's a little bit of bonus information for you. I mentioned this before, but I do play roller derby here in Savannah for the Savannah Derby Devils, and my derby name is Skates of Wrath. So maybe you should remember that, write it down. Maybe it'll come in handy on test day. But that's all I'll say. I'm sure you can get the hint. Thanks again for tuning in. Hope you have a great week. I'll see you during finals week. All right. Bye, everybody.